What if I told you that before some of Africa's most powerful politicians ever headed national office, they were already knee-deep in shady online scams? From elaborate email scams to money laundering networks, these stories remind us that corruption doesn't start in office, it often begins long before. Welcome back to African Insider, where we peel back the layers of Africa's untold political scandals. As you already know, this ranking uses court records, Interpol notices, UNODC, Transparency International Index, IMF data set. Now, the evidence. The expose narrator leads us into the record, official filings, asset trails, and verified documents. Thank you, Dr. Komla. Today we go on record with a ranked brief on 7 African politicians exposed for online fraud before taking office. Phishing dressed as policy, server logs filed the correction.
This ranking uses court records, Interpol notices, UNODC Transparency International Indexes, IMF datasets, World Bank Stolen Asset Recovery, known as STAR, and verified investigative journalism from ICIJ. Each entry is scored against 10 universal criteria with gaps clearly stated. The top 7 on the list is James Onanef Ibori, Nigeria, alleged wire fraud. Case spotlight. Long-running international prosecutions exposed extensive laundering and concealed property holdings connected to his pre-office activities. Identity. James Ibori, former governor of Delta State, Nigeria, a high-profile state executive who later faced multi-jurisdictional criminal and confiscation proceedings. Snapshot, indicators, and status. Court records show pleaded guilty counts for fraud and money laundering. Large-scale asset restraint and confiscation orders were later applied in London. His legal status includes active appeals and outstanding confiscation enforcement. Investigative detail. The decisive UK guilty plea occurred in February of 2012, and the sentencing was on 17 April 2012 to a custodial term. Subsequent confiscation proceedings in London determined at least 101.5 million British pounds available for confiscation, with an 8-year default prison term for non-payment recorded in a Crown Prosecution Service notice on 21 July 2023. U.S. restraining orders and Department of Justice filings show parallel asset restraints and identified specific U.S. properties and bank accounts tied to companies named in UK filings. Financial trace and beneficial ownership map. Judgments and restraint affidavits identify multiple nominee companies used to receive transfers. Court exhibits trace wire transfers through correspondent banks in Europe and the United States to property purchases in London and Houston. Mission recap. UK and US authorities pursued asset restraint and confiscation. Sentencing and subsequent confiscation orders aimed to recover proceeds traced to pre-office misconduct. National context. The jurisdiction was Nigeria. Ibori's case exposed how cross-border concealment of proceeds can follow early fraud into high political office. Accountability, sanctions, and disciplinary status. A UK custodial sentence was imposed in 2012. Confiscation orders in excess of 101 million euros have been recorded. Enforcement steps continue. Gap clarifier. Media reports cite higher aggregated loss figures, court documents confirmed specific sums, and available asset valuations only. The next entry shows how procurement-style fraud evolved into large-scale tender fraud tied to political networks. The top 6 on the list is John Block, South Africa, alleged wire fraud and money laundering. Case spotlight. Provincial procurement fraud and money laundering prosecutions revealed elaborate front companies and falsified invoices. Identity. John Block, former member of the Executive Council for Transport, Roads and Public Works, Northern Cape, South Africa. He later served as Provincial African National Congress chairperson before his conviction. Snapshot: indicators and status. Evidence in Northern Cape High Court files links him to inflated contracts and kickback structures. He was found guilty at trial in 2015 and began serving a custodial sentence after appeals elapsed. Investigative detail. The Northern Cape High Court judgment and subsequent Supreme Court of Appeal documentation describe a scheme involving property leases and inflated procurement costs, with Mr. Block found to have used intermediaries linked to Trifecta Holdings to facilitate the transactions. The Supreme Court of Appeal files include detailed findings on evidentiary insufficiency for some counts and confirm convictions on others, clarifying which charges were sustained on appeal and which were not. Judgments list identified invoices, grading applications, and CIDB-related documents used to justify contract awards. These formed part of the documentary ledger relied upon by prosecutors. Financial trace and beneficial ownership map. Court exhibits and forensic reports define the flow of funds from government accounts to front companies and then to nominee accounts. Mission recap. The case shows how provincial contract manipulation can mirror the mechanics used in online financial fraud. Judicial action produced convictions, custodial sentences, and asset-related orders. National context. The jurisdiction was South Africa. This case highlighted weaknesses in procurement oversight and verification at the provincial level. Accountability, sanctions, and disciplinary status. He was convicted of corruption, fraud, and money laundering in October 2015. Sentencing culminated in a lengthy custodial term and ongoing legal processes relating to parole and appeals. Gap clarifier. Some counts were overturned on appeal. Records show nuanced outcomes across multiple charges. The next case will track port-level contracting anomalies that foreshadow larger money flows.
The top 5 on the list is Olabode George, Nigeria. Lagos NPA wire fraud case, 2009-2013. Case spotlight. Long-standing NPA contract scandals produced convictions, later challenged and partly quashed on appeal. Identity. Olabode George, former chairman of the Nigerian Ports Authority and prominent National Party chieftain. He served at senior levels in party and agency governance before prolonged legal battles. Snapshot. Indicators and status. A Lagos High Court conviction in 2009 led to imprisonment for diversion of 60 million naira in public funds. The Supreme Court later quashed convictions relating to the NPA contracts on technical grounds in December 2013. Investigative detail. Lagos trial records detail manipulated contract awards, including falsified documentation and non-existent supplier operations used to process payments. Appeal records and Supreme Court summaries explain that the legal basis for conviction was set aside because of procedural and statutory timing issues, rather than a factual exoneration of the underlying procurement concerns. Financial trace and beneficial ownership map. Investigations named companies that received diverted funds and traced initial disbursements into accounts controlled by intermediaries. Mission recap. The episode exposed governance gaps at a major state agency and how diverted funds moved through nominee companies. Legal outcomes showed convictions at trial, followed by partial reversal at the apex court. National context. The jurisdiction was Nigeria. High-level agency procurement processes lacked safeguards that would have detected nominee companies and false documentation earlier. Accountability, sanctions, and disciplinary status. A Lagos High Court sentence and imprisonment followed the 2009 conviction. The Supreme Court's later quashing convictions changed the formal sanction profile, leaving unresolved administrative and reputational consequences. Gap clarifier. Some documentary trails remain sealed or procedurally excluded from public judgments. Alleged internet-specific modalities are not fully detailed in the public filings. The next on the list exposes where CIDR-enabled payment corridors and nominee structures cross into the national office. The top 4 on the list is Teodoro and Nguema Obiang Mangwa, Equatorial Guinea, wire fraud proceeds, U.S. civil asset forfeiture. Case Spotlight. United States civil forfeiture complaints and international seizures linked lapsed U.S. purchases to suspected embezzlement and opaque corporate layers. Identity. Teodoro and Nguema Obiang, known as Teodoran, second vice president of Equatorial Guinea. He served in senior government roles before and after major foreign asset litigation. Snapshot. Indicators and status. U.S. complaints traced luxury goods and real estate to nominee entities. Swiss and U.S. authorities pursued asset seizures and negotiated forfeiture settlements. Formal civil forfeiture litigation concluded in U.S. settlements. Criminal investigations occurred in other jurisdictions. Investigative detail. A U.S. civil forfeiture complaint filed on 25 October 2011 lists specific assets allegedly obtained with proceeds traceable to public corruption. The complaint names intermediaries and corporate purchasers used to acquire a Malibu mansion, a Gulfstream G5 jet, and collectible memorabilia.
A 2014 Department of Justice settlement required relinquishment of more than $30 million in assets and identified transactions routed through U.S. dealers and nominee companies. Court exhibits show documentary proof of nominee company purchase agreements and support letters used to mask beneficial ownership. Financial trace and beneficial ownership map. U.S. filings detail shell companies registered in the United States and in offshore jurisdictions. Payment chains show correspondent banking entries into U.S. accounts used to fund high-value purchases. Mission recap. U.S. authorities deployed the Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative to freeze and recover suspect assets. Settlements deprived him of significant U.S.-based holdings and prevented resales through U.S. markets. National context. The jurisdiction was Equatorial Guinea. These cases highlighted how high-level officials moved value through global luxury markets. Accountability, sanctions, and disciplinary status. U.S. civil forfeiture and negotiated forfeiture recovered prioritized assets. Swiss and other actions supplemented those steps. Gap clarifier. The U.S. civil case is a forfeiture action, not a criminal conviction in U.S. federal court for Teodoran. The top 3 on the list is Yahya Jammeh, the Gambia, wire fraud and trust structures. Case Spotlight. Multi-jurisdictional civil forfeiture and asset tracing actions tied luxury U.S. property purchases to alleged official embezzlement through shell accounts. Identity. Yahya Jammeh, former president of the Gambia. He held national executive power before losing office and while alleged cyber fund laundering networks were established. Snapshot, indicators, and status. U.S. complaints and forfeiture orders identify a Potomac, Maryland mansion and trust structures allegedly funding foreign property. Swiss and U.S. instruments targeted trusts and family-linked entities. Civil forfeiture proceedings culminated in asset recovery orders in the United States. Investigative detail. A Department of Justice forfeiture complaint filed in July of 2020 alleged that Jammeh and close associates used shell companies and trusts to acquire U.S. real estate and other assets. Exhibits attached to the complaint identify wire transfers routed through correspondent banks and payments made by trusts controlled by family members. A Potomac, Maryland property was the subject of a separate default judgment forfeiture on 24 May 2022. U.S. filings reference travel and hospitality expenditures inconsistent with official remuneration levels, documented through bank statements and invoices. Financial trace and beneficial ownership map. DOJ materials lay out trust instruments and nominee setups used to shield the beneficial owner. OFAC designations later targeted persons and entities that facilitated support and maintenance of those structures. Mission recap. U.S. civil forfeiture sought recovery of specific properties and funds linked to alleged embezzlement. Swiss and other international actions complemented those recovery efforts. National context. The jurisdiction was the Gambia. These civil forfeiture steps illustrated how proceeds allegedly moved from state coffers into international real estate markets. Accountability, sanctions, and disciplinary status. Forfeiture orders in U.S. courts returned at least one high-value property into official recovery channels. Gap clarifier. Criminal prosecutions in the Gambia and in other states vary. Several proceedings remain administrative or civil.
The top two on the list is Dizani Alison Madueke, Nigeria. Wire fraud, asset concealment, US-UK civil forfeiture. Case spotlight. Many thought it was only oil money that she looted, but there was more to this woman's fraudulent dealings. Asset forfeiture litigation in the United States and prolonged freezing orders in the United Kingdom revealed extensive purchase patterns and nominee networks tied to ministry influence. Identity. Dizani Alison Madueke, former Minister of Petroleum Resources of Nigeria. She served as a federal cabinet minister and later faced long-running international asset investigations. Snapshot. Indicators and status. U.S. and U.K. investigations identified dozens of properties, suspended bank accounts, and high-value items linked to intermediaries. U.S. civil returns and EFCC restraint orders formed the backbone of asset recovery actions. Investigative detail. A Department of Justice complaint in July of 2017 targeted property purchases allegedly facilitated by Nigerian oil industry intermediaries, naming co-conspirators and specific London area real estate acquisitions. U.S. investigations traced payments for luxury furniture in Houston and high-end real estate purchases near London to companies connected to the oil sector. A recent U.S. repatriation, announced in January of 2025, returned approximately $52.88 million in seized assets linked to these investigations. EFCC searches and notices in 2015 and 2017 documented domestic seizures and identified boxes of gold and other artifacts in seized residences. Financial trace and beneficial ownership map. Court filings list named intermediary companies and overseas trustees used to hold real estate titles. Forensic purchase ledgers show step payments to U.S. vendors and onward transfers to London escrow accounts. Mission recap. U.S. and U.K. restraints and EFCC actions in Nigeria targeted the same cluster of assets and vendors. Recovered funds have been earmarked for repatriation and public program use. National context. The jurisdiction was Nigeria. The case highlighted how oil sector patronage and overseas luxury markets can be used to conceal proceeds. Accountability, sanctions, and disciplinary status. Civil forfeiture in the United States achieved recoveries. UK freezing orders persisted, and EFCC initiated domestic administrative steps. Gap clarifier. Some asset allegations remain subject to active litigation and appeal in multiple jurisdictions. The next entry reveals how entrenched patronage and procurement capture can be documented using commission transcripts and forensic contract reviews. The top one on the list is Jacob Zuma, South Africa. Wire fraud or procurement fraud and asset concealment via shell companies. Case spotlight. A judicial commission of inquiry and ongoing criminal indictments documented systemic procurement capture and disputed payments tied to political networks. Identity. Jacob Zuma, former president of South Africa. He served as head of state and later faced multiple high-profile probes and prosecutions. Snapshot. Indicators and status. The Zonda state capture condition produced voluminous findings linking political actors to procurement irregularities. Separate criminal charges related to the 1999 arms deal and other matters remain on foot and subject to continuous litigation.
Investigatory detail. The Judicial Commission of Inquiry into Allegations of State Capture,
The Zondo Commission published multi-volume reports documenting undue influence over appointments and contract awards. The commission recommended further investigations and possible prosecutions for procurement irregularities tied to state-owned enterprises and private intermediaries. Pressing criminal charges in relation to the 1999 arms deal were reactivated in recent years and have been the subject of repeated pre-trial litigation. Zondo transcripts contain supplier invoices, internal memos, and witness statements which prosecutors may use to trace illicit flows. Financial trace and beneficial ownership map. Commission exhibits and forensic audit annexes reveal networks of consultants, front companies, and irregular bank movements used to route funds to political actors. Mission recap. The Zondo findings shifted public and prosecutorial attention to state-captured networks. Investigations now seek to convert commission evidence into prosecutable financial charges. National context. The jurisdiction was South Africa. The case exposed vulnerabilities in procurement oversight across state-owned enterprises and private intermediaries. Accountability, sanctions, and disciplinary status. Zondo recommended prosecutions. Courts continue to process pre-trial and corruption-related matters. Some political figures received administrative or party discipline. Criminal processes remain ongoing. Gap clarifier. The commission is not a criminal court. Its findings require prosecutorial follow-up to produce convictions on specific financial charges. Government of South Africa. Surprised by the placements? The top 3 will challenge assumptions about secrecy versus records. If you track the gaps and the recoveries, you will see why. And so, the curtain falls on this dossier of Africa's most scandal-ridden power players. From Delta State to Pretoria, from Malabo to Banjul, one thread runs unbroken: the fusion of politics and digital age corruption. These cases show how email scams, shell companies, and laundering networks blurred into statecraft, turning leaders into facilitators of fraud. But beyond the headlines, court filings and financial trails tell a sharper story of ordinary citizens betrayed, of public trust siphoned into offshore accounts, and of political elites who saw cyberspace not as an engine for development, but as a private cash register. This top 7 list does not close the file. If anything, it marks a beginning, a record to be revisited as new indictments are unsealed, new financial intelligence leaks surface, and new names emerge from the shadows of transnational internet crime. Because in the end, fraud leaves a paper trail, and paper trails, when followed, always lead back to those who thought power would protect them. Stay with us. More exposés are coming. Subscribe, share, and keep watching as we uncover the untold, because the next revelation might be closer to home than you think.